This photo of three siblings seems innocent until historians discovered the real story behind it. The photograph arrived at the Nebraska State Historical Society in a donated collection from an estate sale in Omaha. Rachel Morrison, a curator specializing in pioneer-era photography, opened the archival box expecting the usual assortment of family portraits and landscape images. What she found was a collection of nearly 200 photographs documenting life in rural Nebraska from 1890 to 1930, many unlabeled and unidentified. One photograph immediately caught her attention. It showed three children standing together on what appeared to be a train platform. Two girls and a boy, ages that Rachel estimated at roughly 6, 8, and 10 years old. They wore matching dark coats that looked new, their hair neatly combed, faces scrubbed clean. The boy stood in the middle with a girl on each side, and all three were holding hands. At first glance, it seemed like a typical portrait of siblings dressed in their Sunday best, perhaps traveling to visit relatives or posing before a special occasion. The children's expressions were serious, as was common in 19th century photography, due to long exposure times, but there was something else in their faces that Rachel couldn't quite identify. Not quite fear, not quite sadness, but something heavy and resigned. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded pencil, was a single line: Orphan train arrivals Grand Island Depot, April 1912. Rachel's breath caught. Orphan train. She had heard of the movement, knew it had operated for decades, but had never seen documentation from Nebraska. She examined the photograph more carefully, and details she had initially overlooked suddenly became significant. The children's coats, while new-looking, didn't fit properly. The boy's sleeves were too short, exposing his wrists. The younger girl's coat hung past her knees, clearly sized for someone older. The older girl's coat was buttoned incorrectly, as if someone else had dressed her hastily. Rachel reached for her magnifying glass and began examining the image more closely. That's when she saw them. Small white rectangles pinned to each child's chest. She adjusted the angle of her desk lamp and increased the magnification. The rectangles were cards or tags, each bearing a number. The boy wore number 23, the younger girl number 24, the older girl number 25. They had been numbered, like livestock, like inventory waiting to be claimed. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she continued her examination. At the children's feet were three small bags or bundles, the kind that might hold a few changes of clothes and personal belongings. She zoomed in on these bags and noticed something crucial. Each bag had a name tag attached, and the names were different. The boy's bag read Thomas Riley. The younger girl's read Margaret O'Brien. The older girl's read Katherine Murphy. They weren't siblings. They were three separate children, likely orphans or abandoned children from New York or another eastern city, dressed identically and posed together as if they were a family. Rachel felt sick as the implications settled over her. This photograph documented something far darker than a simple family portrait. She looked at the children's hands again, at the way they gripped each other. The boy's knuckles were white with tension. The younger girl's fingers were wrapped so tightly around his that they seemed to blur in the photograph. The older girl's other hand, the one not holding the younger child, was clenched into a fist at her side. Rachel examined the background of the photograph. Behind the children, slightly out of focus, stood several adults, men in suits and hats, women in long dresses. They weren't posing for the photograph. They were standing in clusters, and some appeared to be pointing toward the children or consulting papers in their hands. They were prospective parents, farmers and shopkeepers and housewives who had come to the train station to select children for adoption, or more accurately, as Rachel knew from her historical research, to select free labor for their farms and businesses. This wasn't a family portrait. This was documentation of a transaction. These three children, dressed in donated coats and numbered like products, were about to be separated and distributed to strangers who had come to claim them. Rachel spent the next 2 days researching everything she could find about the orphan. What she discovered was a chapter of American history that was simultaneously celebrated as charitable work and condemned as child trafficking, depending on perspective and circumstance. The movement had begun in 1854, founded by Charles Loring Brace in the Children's Aid Society of New York. Brace had been horrified by the number of homeless and orphaned children living on the streets of New York City, sleeping in alleyways, stealing food to survive, vulnerable to disease, abuse, and early death. His solution was to gather these children and send them west on trains to rural communities where, theoretically, they would be adopted by farming families who needed help and could provide homes. Between 1854 and 1929, more than 200,000 children had been placed through the system. They traveled in groups, sometimes dozens at a time, accompanied by agents from various charitable organizations. When the train arrived in a town, the children were assembled at the depot or local church, and community members came to inspect them and select which ones they wanted to take home. Some children found genuine love and family through this system. Some were adopted by childless couples who cherished them. Some grew up to become successful farmers, teachers, business owners, grateful for the opportunity they had been given. But many others experienced something far different. They were taken as unpaid laborers, worked brutally on farms, treated as servants rather than family members, physically and emotionally abused. Some were separated from biological siblings and never saw their brothers and sisters again. Some maintained their birth names. Others were renamed by their new families, their original identities erased. Many were never legally adopted at all, remaining in a limbo status where they belonged to no one and could be sent away at any time if they proved unsatisfactory. Rachel found historical accounts from adults who had been orphan train riders. Their testimonies varied wildly. Some remembered kind families and opportunities they never would have had in New York's tenements. Others described years of unpaid labor, sleeping in barns, being beaten for minor infractions, and watching their adoptive families lavish affection on biological children while treating the orphan train child as an employee at best, a burden at worst. The system had been controversial even in its own time. Critics called it child trafficking, pointing out that the charitable organizations made no serious effort to vet the families who took children, conducted minimal follow-up to ensure the children's welfare, and prioritized emptying New York's orphanages over ensuring good outcomes for individual children. Rachel contacted Dr. Stephen Walsh, a historian at the University of Nebraska, who had written extensively about the orphan train movement in the Midwest. She sent him scans of the photograph and asked if he could help identify the specific train arrival it documented. Dr. Walsh called her back within hours, his voice urgent. "This is remarkable documentation. We have very few photographs from actual placement events. Most of what survives are either posed publicity photos created by the charitable organizations or later portraits of successfully placed children. This image appears to show the moment right before selection, which makes it extraordinarily rare and historically significant. Can you tell me anything about this specific arrival?" Grand Island, April 1912. Let me check the records. The Children's Aid Society kept logs of train departures and destinations. If this was one of their placements, there should be documentation. While waiting for Dr. Walsh's research, Rachel decided to try identifying the 3 children in the photograph. She had their first names from the baggage tags and their approximate ages. Census records, birth certificates, and orphanage intake documents might provide additional information. She started with New York City records, searching for children matching the names and ages who had entered orphanages or charitable institutions between 1900 and 1912. Rachel found Thomas Riley first. Birth records from 1902 listed a Thomas Patrick Riley, born in Manhattan to Irish immigrant parents Daniel and Mary Riley. Daniel had worked as a dock worker. Mary had done piecework sewing at home. In 1908, when Thomas was 6 years old, both parents died during a typhoid outbreak that swept through their tenement building. Thomas had been placed initially in the New York Foundling Hospital, a Catholic orphanage that cared for thousands of abandoned and orphaned children. The intake records described him as healthy, quiet, obedient, suitable for placement. In April 1912, his name appeared on a list of children selected for Western placement through a joint program between the Foundling Hospital and the Children's Aid Society. Margaret O'Brien's story was grimmer. Born in 1906, she had been abandoned at age 2 at the New York Foundling Hospital with a note pinned to her coat. "Her name is Margaret. Please care for her. I cannot." Me? No parents identified, no family history recorded. She had spent her entire remembered life in institutional care, moving between the Foundling Hospital and several temporary foster homes that repeatedly returned her, citing behavioral problems. The orphanage records painted a picture of a child who cried frequently, had difficulty sleeping, and clung desperately to adult caregivers. Overly attached and emotionally demanding, one report noted, and would benefit from placement in structured rural environment with firm discipline. Katherine Murphy had lost her parents in different circumstances. Her mother had died in childbirth in 1904 when Katherine was 2 years old. Her father, unable to care for a toddler while working long hours in a factory, had remarried quickly. The stepmother had not wanted Katherine. In 1910, Katherine's father brought her to the Children's Aid Society and signed papers surrendering her for placement, claiming he could no longer afford to keep her. Katherine's intake interview, recorded by a social worker, was heartbreaking. Child asked repeatedly when her father would return for her, explained multiple times that she is being placed for adoption and will not return to her previous home. Child appears not to comprehend or accept this explanation. All 3 children had arrived in institutional care for different reasons: epidemic, abandonment, family rejection, but their paths had converged in the spring of 1912 when they were selected for the same orphan train heading west. Rachel found the departure manifest. Train 47, departing New York City on April 18, 1912, with scheduled stops in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. 43 children aboard, ranging in age from 3 to 15. The timing struck Rachel with additional sadness. April 18, 1912 was just 3 days after the Titanic sank. The newspapers would have been filled with stories of that disaster, of children orphaned by the tragedy, of wealthy families destroyed and poor immigrants who never even made it to America. And on that same day, 43 already orphaned children were boarding a different kind of ship, heading into their own uncertain future. Dr. Walsh sent Rachel additional documentation he had found in the Children's Aid Society archives. The agent who accompanied Train 47 was a woman named Miss Florence Harmon, a social worker who had been placing children for 6 years. Her reports were preserved in the archives, and Dr. Walsh had scanned the pages related to the Grand Island placement. Miss Harmon's handwriting was neat and efficient, her tone professional but not unkind. She had written, April 22, 1912, Grand Island, Nebraska. Arrived with 21 children still needing placement after previous stops. A local committee had organized viewing at train depot. Approximately 60 families in attendance. Children were cleaned and dressed in donated clothing provided by local church ladies. Numbers pinned to identify each child with their paperwork. She had documented the placement of each child with brief notes. Child number 19, placed with Anderson family, farmer, 3 miles north of town. Child number 20, placed with Methodist minister and wife, in-town residence. Child number 21, placed with widow woman operating boarding house, will assist with domestic work. Rachel scanned down the list until she found the 3 from the photograph. Child number 23, Thomas Riley, age 10, placed with Hendricks family, wheat farm, 15 miles west. Child number 24, Margaret O'Brien, age 6, placed with Swenson family, dairy operation, 8 miles south. Child number 25, Katherine Murphy, age 8, placed with Peterson family, general store operators, in-town residence above shop. 3 different families, 3 different directions. The children who had traveled together for days, who had held hands on that platform, who had been photographed as if they were siblings, were separated within hours of arrival. Rachel continued examining the photograph with increasing attention to detail. She had identified the children and knew their names and backgrounds. Now she wanted to understand exactly when and why this photograph had been taken, and by whom. The image quality suggested a professional photographer, not a casual snapshot. The composition was deliberate, the lighting carefully managed despite being outdoors. Someone with proper equipment and skill had made this image, but who had commissioned it, and for what purpose? Rachel found the answer in an unexpected place. While searching through digitized newspapers from Grand Island in April 1912, she discovered a small article in the Grand Island Daily Independent dated April 25, 1912, 3 days after the train's arrival. Orphan children find new homes. Last Monday, the Children's Aid Society train brought 21 homeless waifs to our city, where they were received by families eager to provide them with Christian homes and useful employment. The children, ranging from small tots to sturdy youths, were examined by prospective parents at the depot, and all were successfully placed with respectable families in Grand Island and surrounding communities. Local photographer Mr. Howard Jensen documented the arrival for the Society's records. This charitable work continues to benefit both the children, who escape the degradation of city streets, and our farming families, who gain willing helpers. Howard Jensen. Rachel searched for information about him, and found that he had operated a photography studio in Grand Island from 1905 to 1920. His advertisements in local newspapers promoted fine portraiture, family groups, and documentary photography. He had apparently contracted with the Children's Aid Society to document orphan train arrivals, creating images that could be used in the organization's promotional materials and annual reports. This explained the photograph's professional quality, but it raised disturbing questions about its purpose. Was this image created to document the children's arrival for the Society's records, or was it stage propaganda, designed to show potential donors and supporters how well the children were being cared for? How healthy and presentable they looked in their new coats? Rachel examined the photograph again with this new understanding. The children's matching coats suddenly seemed less like kindness and more like costume, dressing them up to look more appealing, more adoptable. The serious expressions weren't just Victorian formality, they were the faces of children who understood what was about to happen to them. She found additional information in Miss Harmon's reports. The agent had written about the preparation process. Children were bathed and dressed in clean clothing provided by local charitable ladies. Those with behavioral difficulties or unappealing appearances were coached on proper deportment. We emphasized to the children the importance of making a good impression, as their future prospects depended on being selected by quality families. The phrase, "those with behavioral difficulties or unappealing appearances," made Rachel's stomach turn. Children traumatized by loss, abandonment, and institutional care were being judged on their ability to perform normality, to suppress their grief and fear long enough to be chosen. Rachel contacted a photography historian at the Library of Congress who specialized in 19th and early 20th century documentary photography. She sent him the image and asked for his analysis of the composition and intention behind it. His response arrived by email 2 days later. This photograph exhibits characteristics of what we would now call propaganda imagery, though that term wasn't commonly used in this context at the time. The composition deliberately presents the children as a unit, suggesting family cohesion and implying they will remain together. The matching coats create visual harmony and suggest institutional care and organization. The photographer has positioned them to face the camera directly, establishing what appears to be confidence and readiness. However, several elements undermine this intended message. The visible numbering tags reduce the children to inventory. The ill-fitting clothing suggests hasty preparation rather than genuine care. Most significantly, the children's body language, the desperate hand-holding, the tension visible in their postures, reveals fear and resistance to what's happening. This is a photograph that intended to show institutional charity and successful child-saving work, but instead documented something closer to human trafficking. The photographer may not have recognized this contradiction, or may have been powerless to address it while fulfilling his contract. Rachel decided to trace what happened to each child after they left that train platform. She started with Thomas Riley, who had been placed with the Hendricks family on a wheat farm 15 miles west of Grand Island. Census records from 1920 showed the Hendricks household: Lars Hendricks, age 52, farmer; Anna Hendricks, age 48, wife; and one additional resident listed as Thomas Hendricks, age 18, farm laborer. His surname had been changed. His relationship to the head of household was listed as laborer, not son, or even adopted child. Rachel searched for any documentation of a legal adoption, but found nothing. The Hendricks family had never formally adopted Thomas. He had simply become part of their household, a worker with no legal rights or protections. She found more information in county records. The Hendricks farm had been 320 acres of wheatland, worked primarily by Lars and Thomas. There were no other laborers listed, no hired help. Thomas, from age 10 onward, had been the sole source of assistance on a farm that size. Dr. Walsh helped Rachel locate records from the Nebraska State Board of Control, which had conducted occasional inspections of orphan train placements. An inspector had visited the Hendricks farm in 1914, 2 years after Thomas's placement. The report was brief. Child appears adequately fed and clothed, working in fields alongside Mr. Hendricks. No complaints expressed. Placement deemed satisfactory. But no mention of education. No mention of whether Thomas was being treated as family or as unpaid labor. Just satisfactory. Rachel found Thomas's World War I draft registration card from 1918. He had been 20 years old, living on the Hendricks farm, occupation listed as farm laborer. The card included a physical description: height 5'9", medium build, blue eyes, brown hair. In the space for nearest relative, he had written none. After the war, Thomas appeared in city directories for Grand Island. He had moved off the farm and was working as a warehouse laborer. In 1921, he married a woman named Dorothy Klein. In 1922, they had a daughter named Helen. Rachel found an interview that had been conducted in 1965 by a local historical society volunteer who was documenting early settlers' experiences. Thomas, then 63 years old, had agreed to talk about his life. The interview had been recorded and transcribed. The volunteer had asked him about coming to Nebraska on the orphan train. Thomas's response was measured, careful. "I was brought here as a boy, went to work on a farm. It was hard work, but farming is always hard work. The Hendricks family gave me a place to live and food to eat. I learned agriculture, which served me well enough." "Did you consider them your family?" There was a long pause on the recording before Thomas answered. "No, they were the people I worked for. When I was old enough, I left. Do you have any contact with them now?" "No. Lars died in 1935. Anna died in 1940. I didn't attend either funeral." "What about your birth family in New York? Did you ever try to find them?" Another long pause. "My parents died when I was 6. I had no other family. Or if I did, they didn't want me. That's why I was on that train." The interviewer had asked about his experience on the train itself, whether he remembered the other children. Thomas's answer was the most revealing part of the interview. "I remember 3 of us got off at Grand Island, 2 girls and me. We'd been traveling together for days. The younger girl, she was scared the whole time, cried at night. The older one tried to take care of her, tried to keep her quiet so the adults wouldn't get angry. When we got to Grand Island, they separated us, put us with different families going different directions. The little one was crying, holding on to me. They had to pry her hands away. I can still hear her screaming my name as they took her away. That was 60 years ago, and I can still hear it." Finding information about Margaret O'Brien proved more difficult. Rachel searched census records, city directories, and county documents, looking for any trace of the 6-year-old girl who had been placed with the Swenson family on their dairy farm. She found the Swenson family in the 1920 census. Otto Swenson, age 45, dairy farmer. Hulda Swenson, age 42, wife. 4 biological children ranging in age from 8 to 16. No Margaret listed. Had she been there in 1912 but gone by 1920? Rachel searched backward, looking for the 1915 state census that Nebraska had conducted. The Swenson household appeared: Otto, Hulda, their 4 children, and one additional person listed as Margaret Swenson, age 9, labor. So Margaret had still been there in 1915, 3 years after placement. But she had disappeared from the household by 1920. What had happened in those 5 years? Rachel expanded her search to death records. She found it in the Nebraska State Board of Health records from 1917. Margaret O'Brien, age 11, died March 14, 1917, Hall County. Cause of death: pneumonia secondary to complications from injuries sustained in farm accident. 11 years old. She had survived 5 years on the Swenson farm before dying from a farm accident. Rachel searched for any additional documentation about the accident, but found nothing. No police report, no inquest, no newspaper article. Just a death certificate filed by a country doctor who had examined the body and recorded the cause. Rachel contacted the Hall County Historical Society and asked if they had any records related to the Swenson farm or any accidents there in 1917. A volunteer researcher named Ellen Martinez searched their archives and found something unexpected: a letter written by the local school teacher to the county superintendent of schools in 1916, 1 year before Margaret's death. Ellen scanned and sent the letter. It read, "I write to express concern about a student enrolled in our one-room school near the Swenson dairy farm. The child, Margaret Swenson, though I believe her legal name may be different, attends irregularly and appears to have sustained frequent injuries. When questioned, she attributes these to farm accidents, falling from ladders, being kicked by cows, dropping equipment. However, the frequency of these incidents troubles me. Additionally, the child appears undernourished and inadequately clothed for winter weather. I have attempted to raise these concerns with Mr. and Mrs. Swenson, but they have responded by withdrawing the child from school entirely, stating that she is needed for farm work and that her education is unnecessary. I am uncertain what authority I have to intervene, but I feel compelled to document my concerns should future circumstances warrant investigation." The letter had been filed away and apparently never acted upon. No investigation had been conducted. Margaret had been removed from school, isolated on the farm, and died less than a year later at age 11. Rachel felt rage building as she read this documentation. A teacher had noticed, had tried to help, had put her concerns in writing, and nothing had been done. The system that had placed Margaret with the Swensons had conducted no follow-up, had provided no protection, had allowed a child to be worked, injured, and ultimately killed with no accountability. Dr. Walsh helped Rachel locate Margaret's burial site. She was interred in a rural cemetery near the Swenson farm, in a section typically used for indigent burials or those without family. Her grave marker was a simple stone with minimal inscription. Margaret, 1906-1917. Not even her full name. Not beloved daughter or any familial designation. Just Margaret in the years of her short life. Rachel visited the cemetery on a gray afternoon in October. The grave was in a far corner overgrown with grass. The small stone tilted and weathered. She stood there for a long time, thinking about the 6-year-old girl who had clutched Thomas's hand on that train platform, who had screamed his name when they separated her, who had spent 5 years of hard labor on a dairy farm before dying of pneumonia secondary to complications from injuries. Katherine Murphy, the oldest of the 3 children in the photograph, had been placed with the Peterson family, who operated a general store in Grand Island. Rachel found her more easily in census records because she had remained in town rather than being taken to a remote farm. The 1920 census showed Katherine Peterson, age 16, daughter attending school. Her surname had been changed to Peterson, and she was listed as a daughter rather than a laborer or ward. This suggested a potentially better outcome than Thomas or Margaret had experienced. Rachel found Katherine's high school records. She had attended Grand Island High School from 1915 to 1919, graduating at age 17. Her grades were solid, mostly B's with a few A's in English and history. She had been a member of the Girls' Literary Society and had worked part-time at the Peterson store. After graduation, Katherine appeared in city directories as Katherine Peterson, sales clerk, Peterson General Store. She had continued working for the family that had raised her. In 1924, she married a man named Robert Wilson, a clerk at the railroad office. They had 2 children, born in 1925 and 1927. On the surface, this seemed like a success story, the kind of outcome the Children's Aid Society would have highlighted in their promotional materials. Katherine had been educated, had learned a trade, had married, and started her own family. She appeared to have been integrated into the Peterson family and the Grand Island community. But Rachel found hints of a more complex story in unexpected places. The Peterson Family Bible, donated to the Historical Society by a descendant, included a family tree page where births, deaths, and marriages were recorded. The Petersons' 3 biological children were listed with full birth dates, and the notation, "Our beloved son," or "Our beloved daughter." Katherine was listed separately, with just her name, and the note came to us 1912. Not beloved daughter, not even adopted daughter, just came to us. Rachel found more revealing information in a diary kept by Katherine in the 1940s, after she had married and had children of her own. The diary had been preserved by her daughter and eventually donated to the Nebraska State Historical Society. Rachel requested access to the documents and spent an afternoon reading Katherine's private reflections. Entry from June 1943. "Today is the anniversary of my mother's death. Not Mrs. Peterson, who raised me and whom I called mother for propriety's sake, but my real mother, who died when I was 2 years old and whose face I cannot remember. Mrs. Peterson was never unkind to me, but neither was she warm. I was useful to the family. I worked in the store, I helped with housework, I was presentable and caused no scandal, but I was never truly one of them. I attended family gatherings, but felt always like a guest, someone included out of obligation rather than love." Entry from April 1945. "I dreamed last night about the train. I was 10 years old again, standing on that platform with Thomas and little Margaret. In the dream, I was trying to hold onto them, but people kept pulling us apart. I woke up crying, and Robert asked what was wrong, but how can I explain? How can I tell him about the terror of that day? The feeling of being inspected like livestock, the moment when I realized we 3 would not stay together, despite our desperate clinging to each other. I have not thought about Thomas or Margaret in years. I don't know what became of them. I don't know if they survived, if they found happiness, if they remember me at all." Entry from November 1947. I saw an article in the newspaper about the orphan trains, written as if it were a heartwarming story of charitable work. Thousands of children found new homes, it proclaimed, rescued from poverty and given opportunities in America's heartland. I felt such anger reading it. Yes, some children were fortunate. Some found real families and real love. But many of us were simply sources of free labor, taken by families who needed workers, and saw an opportunity to acquire them without cost. And we were separated from siblings, stripped of our names, erased from our own histories. I was one of the lucky ones. I was educated, I was not physically abused, I was allowed to marry when I chose, but I was never loved as a daughter. And I carry still the guilt of survival, wondering what happened to Thomas and Margaret, whether they fared as well as I did or suffered fates I dare not imagine. Rachel became determined to find out if Katherine had ever reconnected with Thomas or Margaret. The diary entries suggested she had not, that she had spent decades wondering about their fates. But perhaps in later years she had tried to find them. Katherine had died in 1982 at age 78. Rachel contacted her surviving children, a son named David Wilson, now in his 90s and living in a nursing home in Lincoln, and a daughter named Patricia Wilson Jennings, in her 80s and living in Colorado. Patricia agreed to speak with Rachel by phone. Her voice was clear and sharp despite her age. I remember my mother talking about the orphan train when I was young, Patricia said. She didn't speak of it often, and when she did, she would get very quiet and sad. She told me she had traveled from New York with other children, and that she had been separated from 2 of them when they arrived in Nebraska. I asked if she had tried to find them, and she said she wouldn't know where to begin looking. Did she ever mention their names? Rachel asked. Thomas and Margaret. She said those names more than once. I remember because she would say them with such longing, as if saying their names kept them alive somehow. Did your mother save anything from that time? Any documents or mementos? She had a small metal box that she kept in her closet. After she died, we found it among her belongings. Inside were a few items from her childhood. A ribbon from her hair, a photograph of a building she said was the orphanage in New York, and a piece of paper with 2 names written on it over and over, as if she was practicing writing or trying to memorize them. The names were Thomas Riley and Margaret O'Brien. Rachel felt her throat tighten. Katherine had kept those names, had written them repeatedly, had tried to hold on to some connection to the children she had traveled with. Did you keep that box? Do you still have those items? Yes. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. They seemed too important to my mother, even if I didn't fully understand why. I can mail them to you if you think they would be historically valuable. The box arrived a week later. Inside, exactly as Patricia had described, was a faded ribbon, a small photograph of a large institutional building, and a piece of yellowed paper covered in Katherine's handwriting. Thomas Riley and Margaret O'Brien were written dozens of times, the handwriting evolving from the careful printing of a child to the more flowing script of an adult. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that looked more recent, Katherine had written, "I pray you found peace. I pray you were loved. I am sorry I could not protect you." Rachel sat at her desk, holding this piece of paper, and wept. The weight of these children's stories, the trajectory of their separated lives, the questions that Katherine had carried for 70 years, all of it felt overwhelming. But there was one more task Rachel needed to complete. She needed to document what she had learned and create a memorial that acknowledged the truth of what had happened to these 3 children. Rachel organized an exhibition at the Nebraska State Historical Society, titled "Separated: The Untold Stories of Orphan Train Children." The centerpiece was the photograph of Thomas, Margaret, and Katherine, enlarged and displayed with their full stories documented alongside it. The exhibition included the children's intake records from New York orphanages, Miss Harmon's placement reports, census records showing their locations and statuses in various households, Thomas's interview transcript, the schoolteacher's letter about Margaret, excerpts from Katherine's diary, and the piece of paper where Katherine had written their names over and over. Rachel also included historical context about the orphan train movement, statistics on how many children were placed, success and failure rates when such data existed, testimonies from other orphan train riders describing their experiences, and scholarly analysis of how the system had functioned as both genuine charity and exploitative labor trafficking, depending on circumstances and individual families. The exhibition opened on a Saturday morning in March. Among the attendees was David Wilson, Katherine's son, who had traveled from Lincoln with his daughter and grandchildren. Thomas Riley's granddaughter, a woman named Susan Chen, who had found the exhibition through an online genealogy forum, attended with her family. Margaret had no known descendants, but members of the O'Brien family from New York, who had been researching their genealogy and discovered Margaret's story, came to honor her memory. David stood before the photograph of his mother as a child, looking at her serious face, her hand clutching Thomas's. "I never knew," he said quietly. "She never told us how young she was, how terrified she must have been. She always spoke of coming to Nebraska as if it were just something that happened, not a trauma that shaped her entire life." Susan Chen studied the photograph of her grandfather Thomas. "He died when I was 3, so I barely remember him. My mother said he was a kind man but very quiet, that he didn't talk much about his past. She said he sometimes seemed to be waiting for something or looking for something, but she never knew what. Now I understand. He was looking for them, for these 2 girls. He was waiting for someone to tell him what happened to them. The exhibition included a memorial wall where visitors could leave messages or reflections. One message, written by a woman who identified herself as a descendant of another orphan train rider, read, "Thank you for telling the truth about this history. My great-grandmother came west on an orphan train in 1904. She was worked as an unpaid servant until she was 18, then turned out with nothing. She never spoke of it, but her children and grandchildren saw the pain she carried. These stories need to be told, even when they're uncomfortable, especially when they're uncomfortable." The local newspaper covered the exhibition with a long article titled "The Dark Side of Nebraska's Settlement History." It quoted Rachel extensively and included the photograph of Thomas, Margaret, and Katherine with their full stories. The article sparked community conversation about how history is remembered and taught, about the difference between charity and exploitation, and about the need to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the past. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Rachel organized a memorial service to honor Thomas, Margaret, and Katherine. She had located all 3 burial sites: Thomas in Grand Island City Cemetery, Margaret in the rural cemetery near the Swenson Farm, and Katherine in Grand Island's West Lawn Cemetery beside her husband. The 3 graves were miles apart, separated in death, as they had been in life. But Rachel arranged for memorial markers to be placed at each site, linking them together through shared language and design. Each marker included the photograph of the 3 children holding hands, along with text that read, "In memory of the orphan train children who traveled together, were separated, and carried each other in their hearts throughout their lives." Thomas's marker added, "Thomas Patrick Riley, 1902-1978. Remembered by those who loved him and by the children whose hands he held on April 22, 1912. Margaret's marker, replacing the simple stone that had borne only her first name, read, "Margaret O'Brien, 1906 and 1917. Taken too soon? Not forgotten." Katherine's marker included, "Katherine Murphy Wilson, 1904-1982. She remembered, she mourned, she survived." The memorial service was held at Margaret's grave, the most isolated of the 3 sites. Descendants of all 3 children attended, along with members of the community, historians, genealogists, and advocates for child welfare. A minister offered prayers. Patricia read excerpts from her mother's diary. Susan Chen spoke about her grandfather's life and the silence he had maintained about his early years. Rachel spoke last. She talked about the photograph, about what it revealed and what it concealed, about the moment captured when 3 children held onto each other before being torn apart. She talked about the larger history of the orphan train movement, acknowledging both its genuine charitable intentions and its many failures to protect the children it displaced. "History is not just about facts and dates," Rachel said. "It's about individual human experiences, about the children whose faces look out at us from old photographs, asking us to see them, to acknowledge them, to remember that they existed and that what happened to them mattered." Thomas, Margaret, and Katherine were 3 of more than 200,000 children sent west on orphan trains. Some found love and opportunity. Many others found exploitation and suffering. We honor them all by telling the truth about their experiences, by refusing to sanitize history into simple narratives of charity and progress. We honor them by seeing what they wanted us to see when they clutched each other's hands for that photograph. That they were children who needed protection, who deserved love, who should never have been numbered and distributed like inventory. After the service, people lingered at the gravesite, leaving flowers and small tokens. Someone had brought 3 stuffed animals, a bear, a rabbit, and a lamb, and placed them on Margaret's grave. Someone else left a note that read, "You are seen, you are remembered, you mattered." The photograph that had arrived anonymously in a donated collection had become a window into a history that many Americans knew little about. It hung permanently in the Nebraska State Historical Society, a reminder that photographs don't always show what they were intended to show, that looking closely can reveal truths that were meant to remain hidden, and that 3 children holding hands on a train platform in 1912 still had a story to tell more than a century later. Rachel returned to her office after the memorial service and sat at her desk, looking at the photograph on her computer screen. Thomas, Margaret, and Katherine stared back at her, their hands locked together, their faces serious, their numbered tags marking them as inventory in a transaction they hadn't chosen and couldn't control. But they had held on to each other. They had refused to let go until they were forced apart. And in that simple act of connection, in the desperate grip of their intertwined hands, they had left evidence that they were not just numbers, not just orphans to be distributed, but human beings who loved each other, who tried to protect each other, and who deserved to be remembered not as a charitable success story, but as 3 children who survived, suffered, and, in Katherine's case at least, spent 70 years remembering the 2 she had been forced to leave behind.